Disaster can strike for several reasons. Often it can be human error or pure bad luck. But what if there is a far more sinister reason behind it? What if human lives are only used as a means to an end? As a pawn for a cold-hearted game? Let's venture into the vault and try to find out what happened to the MV Dara. The MV Dara, with MV standing for motor vessel, was a ship owned by the British India Steam Navigation Company. She was constructed by Barclay Curle and Company in Glasgow, Scotland, and finished in 1946. British India once had one of the largest fleets in the world, but that was reduced to almost half of it due to World War II. This led to the creation of the 4Ds, a group of 4 ships to modernize and re-equip the line's fleet. These ships were the Damra, the Dvarka, the Dara of course, and the Darissa. They weren't the only ones built to expand the fleet and bring it back to competitive standards, but they stood out through their similar, almost identical designs and names. For this video I will be using a lot of footage of the Dvarka, as there was a wonderful documentary made called An Arabian Voyage that detailed what a trip on these ships was like. That being said, what I found interesting was that many passengers on these ships were deck passengers, meaning they had no cabins. The Dara could carry 134 cabin class passengers, which of course meant people in cabins, but 1,377 passengers on deck. They would get comfortable between the decks or on cargo hatches. The reason why was because the ship operated on a regular service between Indian and Pakistan ports and also Persian Gulf ports. This meant the ship saw a massive flow of Pakistani and Indian workers traveling between home and work, but also a lot of immigrants. And because deck passengers had it cheaper, it could sometimes be that cabin class had very few passengers. Next to that, the ships also played a big role in cargo transport, often fresh fruit for the Arab states and also tea. But yes, all in all, these weren't fancy luxury liners, but working ships. They did their job and offered moderate comfort for anyone who could pay. They visited many ports on their trips, so people didn't really stay aboard for too long. The weather was also usually warm and dry, unless you met any storms or the monsoon season came by. So for deck passengers, it was still a pleasant ride, food and a place to stay. Cabin class passengers, on the other hand, enjoyed more comfortable luxuries. Alongside having their cabins, they also had fancy lounges and lavish dinners. It was a concept that worked, considering the countries many of their passengers traveled from were very poor and only recently began to develop into the modern age. The Dara meant a lot of comfort anyway. It was April 1961. The Dara had been on one of her usual round trips that started out in Mumbai on March 23rd and visited Karachi, Muscat, Dubai, Doha, Bahrain, Kuwait, Khorramshahr, Abadana and Basra. Trying my best here with these words. Now, she was on her return trip and lowered anchor at Dubai on April 7th. There was no big dock for the ship to be moored at, so cargo and passengers had to be ferried to and from with smaller boats. That afternoon, however, this whole process was disturbed when a storm picked up. It became worse and worse. Then at 5:30 p.m. a nearby cargo ship that began drifting collided with the Dara's bow. The damage must have been rather little, as Captain Charles Elson made a sudden decision that would prove fateful. He decided to sail off immediately in an attempt to ride off the storm and get to Muscat before it got any worse. Why this was fateful? because many people who weren't supposed to continue the journey couldn't get off the ship. 128 extra people, consisting of relatives and friends, seeing of passengers, cargo handlers, and various shipping and immigration officials. They were suddenly forced to make the journey. With all passengers and crew, it ended up being 819 people in total. The ship sailed through rough seas, and for the passengers it was a terrible night with constant rolling of the ship, and so eventually it was decided the ship would return to Dubai. At 4:40 a.m. in the morning hours of April 8th, it happened. A sudden explosion ripped through 3 decks of the ship, ravaging through the galley and engine room bulkhead and into the main launch. All of the power and steering systems were immediately knocked out and the water pipes were destroyed. A massive fire broke out, and though attempts were made fast to fight it, there was no water pressure. The ship was rendered without any sort of control, drifting in the sea. Anyone who wasn't killed in the blast was shaken awake by it. Instantly many ran for the lifeboats, and Captain Elson gave the order to abandon ship. It was a terrible sight. People were dying by the minute. Some trampled with masses of people running around in panic. Others jumped into the water, some with and some without life jackets. And because the life jackets were old and hard ones, many who donned them as they jumped broke their necks. Mothers took their children, babies even, and threw them into the sea to spare them from the flames, but then the impact killed them. As the fire spread quickly, many lifeboats were never able to be launched, but the ones that were overcrowded, and one even capsized as people jumped into it. Another lifeboat that did get lowered safely had been damaged during the collision earlier and thus began to sink. Because the sea was still rough, many drowned, and those who didn't meet their end in the sea ended up suffocating from the smoke or burning. It was pure horror that would traumatize many for years to come. Rescue luckily wasn't far. A Norwegian tanker came to the aid, even though it was actually at risk with its cargo of gas. In general, it was quite the international rescue, with vessels that were British, including a tank landing craft, but also German and Japanese vessels, and several from the Emirates. A Navy supply ship was also nearby, but ended up not helping. It was argued it did stay put, as it was loaded with explosives. Some of the crew tried to get back onto the ship in an attempt to turn on the emergency water pumps to try and fight the fire once again, but still no pressure. They saw many charred bodies laying on the decks, and that just hours after the fire had started. 3 British Navy frigates and a US destroyer eventually managed to get proper firefighting parties on board. By dawn, most of the fire had been put out. Salvage vessel Ocean Salver took the crippled Dara in tow to beach her near Dubai. Then around 9:20 a.m. on the 10th of April, the Dara suddenly leaned over. The ship had been so damaged, barely holding itself together, so it just rolled over and sank. Survivors were taken to Dubai. The scale of the disaster overwhelmed Dubai's medical facilities, including the Al Maktoum Hospital. Mind you, Dubai in the 60s was a far cry from the massive city that it is today. Many of the survivors were badly burned or suffered from the effects of exposure. A nearly completed hotel building was taken over as a reception center for the injured, and field stations were opened at Sheikh Rashid's Customs House office block. Relatives searched the city for lost family members, but several of them were never found. 238 of the 819 people on board had lost their lives. So, what happened? Well, First of all, we need a bit of historical context. From 1954 to 1959, there had been the Jebel Akhtar War, which happened in the Sultanate of Muscat and Oman. What was happening was that the local Omanis in the interior of Oman, led by their elected Imam Ghalib al-Hinai, wanted to protect the imamate of Oman from the occupation plans of Sultan Said bin Taimur. The Sultan was backed by the British government, who wanted to gain access to the oil wells in Oman. The imamate of Oman was defeated with the help of the British troops in 1959, but there were significant losses on all sides. This war was not without controversy, mainly because of the imperialistic motivation of the British. Thus the UK was a target for them, because although the war ended, there were still Omani insurgents continuing the conflict through an extensive terrorist campaign. It later led into the Dhofar rebellion to once again attempt to get free from the rule of the Sultan. And this is where we get back to the Dara. An inquiry by the British authorities concluded that the explosion must have been an act of terrorism. Oman rebels who still wanted to overthrow the Sultan were said to have planted an anti-tank mine in a suitcase, which was then smuggled aboard, a time bomb. The Dara was supposed to arrive in Muscat the next morning, and that's when the bomb was supposed to go off, but as we know, she never went there. Since the wreck of the Dara laid in only about 20 meters depth, British Royal Navy divers had gone down there to examine it. They found evidence that suggested the explosion was caused by about 10 kilograms of the type of high explosive used in these mines. However, this technically didn't really count as forensic evidence for a bomb, as it only really suggested that this is what caused it and didn't confirm it. In the aftermath of it, no group claimed responsibility for this act either, whereas many terrorist groups usually take pride in their attacks. That being said, this would have not been the first attack. In fact, 3 of the 4 Ds had seen attacks. The first was seen in 1959 when an explosion occurred on the Dvarka. A bomb that was supposed to kill the Sultan's Minister of the Interior exploded in his first-class cabin, but he escaped with minor injuries. Another bomb exploded on her in June 1961. Next to the Dara and the Dvarka, it was the Darissa who saw another attack. In September 1962, a bomb exploded on her shortly after leaving Dubai, with no loss of life. The Dvarka would be attacked one last time in October 1962. That last time, the damage turned out worse than expected. The Dvarka had narrowly escaped another disaster. These attacks did produce some suspects, the most promising one being Kamis bin Makum Molla Beni Hiria, again excuse me for butchering these names, who ended up confessing to the last attack on the Dvarka, but he just stored a bomb on her in exchange for money. There were also explosions in the city of Dubai and 2 planes that were attacked. One disappeared mid-air with loss of all passengers and crew, and the other one was spared when the bomb exploded in a mailbag before it could be loaded aboard. The Dvarka was the last British India Line ship to be bombed and marked the end of the terrorist campaign in the Gulf, although tensions remained high for several years. What I find really baffling about this is that so many attacks happened and yet security wasn't improved. People carried possessions in multiple boxes and cloth bundles and even took gas stoves for cooking aboard. I mean seriously, even the attacker who confessed to the last Dvarka attack mentioned that his bags were checked half-heartedly, and mind you, this was in 1962, at the last big attack, after the Dara had already sunk and killed so many. Though security officers were placed on these ships in the following years, their task was also impossible. One concluded that individuals would have had no issue smuggling a bomb aboard, and that carrying a security officer was just to comply with the requirements of the insurance company. It is a miracle that there weren't even more large-scale disasters like that. The remaining D ships remained successful throughout the years. The last one to survive was the Dwarka, which actually continued a true liner service up to 1982, well after planes took over. This is how we could get some lovely color footage of the Dwarka used for the Dara here, and it gave great insight into what it was like on these ships, as the concept remained the same until the end. Liners are a thing of the past now. The only true liner active now is the Queen Mary II. Yet one thing that is not of the past is the pain of the survivors and the relatives of the lost ones. Several are still alive now or passed recently. Many families were torn apart and some villages lost a big percentage of their men. Some parents still believed their lost children would come back to them up until they themselves died. It affected so many. No one responsible for the tragedy was ever found, and thus no one was ever charged. Some find closure in the belief that maybe the insurgent who planted the bomb was stuck aboard too and ended up dying, but no one can know for sure. The truth remains that we can only say this might be likely, but if it really is what happened, we might never know. My personal thoughts on this are that yes, this was an act of terrorism. It fits in too well with all the other happenings at the time. My heart goes out to all of the families, all the people affected and in pain. Just like with the Al-Salam Boccaccio 98 ferry disaster that I made a video on previously, this is still fairly recent history. Of course a lot more time has passed, but the pain is still real. This disaster and the wars involved in it are largely forgotten, so I hope I helped spread the story of it. Nowadays the Dara wreck has largely broken apart, but is a popular tourist diving destination. In my opinion, that is sort of problematic, as it is a mass grave. Many people died for nothing. In retrospect, all I can say about this whole disaster is that using human lives as pawns in a deadly game will never be okay. Never. Thank you for tuning into What's the History on A's Vault. I'm A, the owner of this vault filled with all sorts of historical things, and as of late I've begun to change the direction of this channel. You sure like hearing about shipwrecks and disasters, don't you? Well, I myself enjoy these topics a lot because they often shine light on situations that should have never happened, and I think that we can often still learn from them. If you ever have any suggestions, criticism, or just want to voice your thoughts on this, do let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy this kind of content, feel free to subscribe as well. Thank you once again for watching, my lovelies. I hope you have a nice week, and I'll see you next time!